Welcome to Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity today and find out a little bit about their journey, the events that have shaped their career, and maybe the things that still keep them up at night. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sophie Schmieg, a staff information security engineer at Google and an algebraic geometer who specializes in cryptography and post-quantum cryptography. Sophie has made significant contributions to vulnerability research, including discovering vulnerabilities in AWS and Google Duo, and is helping lead the charge in preparing us for a post-quantum computing world. With over a decade of experience spanning academia and industry, Sophie brings a really unique perspective to the world of cryptography, the implementations, and the security. Sophie, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
So we always like to start with where this all began for you. So where did you first become interested in your case, in both the technology side of things and also algebraic geometry?
So I was always interested in mathematics, and then kind of decided to study mathematics in university. And then sort of when I was done with my undergrad, I was like, I would like more of this, please. And looked around for where I could do my PhD, and algebraic geometry sounded very interesting, and went ahead and did algebraic geometry for 5 years, which was very interesting, very fun, and also had very little to do with computer security. Not quite. There is obviously a bridge between algebraic geometry and cryptography, in that cryptography uses a lot of algebraic geometry, but that sort of happened kind of on the side. I studied in Ulm, which is a fairly small university, and the thing is that it was a small enough university that it doesn't have a cryptography department, but it does have to teach undergrads cryptography. So it used to be that the prof for complexity theory and the prof for algebra and algebraic geometry would take turns, and so I had to TA this class in cryptography, and I was like, well, I know enough about this just from being interested in the general topic to know that this isn't how this actually works. But I don't know how it actually works. And I was like, well, I guess I can just buy books and learn the parts that I'm missing. And so that is kind of how I started reading sort of on the side some cryptography books, and didn't actually get into the field of cryptography until several years later. I started at Google afterwards, not in a cryptography team, and only after I then switched roles after 4 years at Google to a new team. I saw that the cryptography team was hiring. I was like, this sounds exciting. And they liked what I was bringing. It was a very nice compliment to what the kind of skills that they had on the team. They had sort of the polar opposite of the very high mathematical education. They had the very, very hands-on thing, and they were like, oh, that is a very nice complementary skill set. From there I started then over time leading the team and getting more involved in PQC and things like that, and got to where I am now.
And what was that original driver for you thinking, I want to go into a tech firm like Google from, working in academia?
So there were multiple factors. There was factors of trying to make a career in academia is very tenuous and not exactly fun, which kind of drove me a bit more towards maybe I should at least look at industry options. And then Google, I had some friends who were working there, or one friend who was working there, and it sounded interesting and sort of similarly engaging at the same time. And it has especially now that I'm actually doing cryptography at Google, it has this very nice applied edge to it that is that was kind of missing in the pure academic setting, where like pure academia can be very, very dry and very much like, yeah, you don't get invited to much podcasts on algebraic geometry.
Well, you say that, but I've actually done my research and I found you invited to quite a few podcasts based on your knowledge of algebraic geometry. So maybe the Google thing helps there, but I don't think that's always the case there.
Yeah, so that is like sort of the other part of like, once you have this algebraic geometry background, this like general mathematician background, you have a very different view on cryptography that is very valuable to the field of cryptography as well. And so like it kind of feels like a bit of a cheat code, where the cheat code involves several years of study in a different field. So maybe not that much of a cheat. But it does give you some approaches that you bring to the table that are somewhat unique, whereas other people bring other things. Like it definitely has a lot of value to have this background, but other backgrounds also have a lot of value there.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating, having been in the industry and I, worked in academia myself for a little while. And there is this thing around computers and technology and security where people will apply cryptography and they will know that this standard, this model is more secure than this algorithm, but they don't necessarily understand the math behind it to understand why that is or how you might approach that in an alternate way. And actually, I thought what was really interesting when we're doing the research about you for this podcast was there's this common misconception about people maybe working in your field that it's all very complex and very serious, and you just lock yourselves away and do these things. You said the thing in academia, right? You maybe don't get invited to do all the podcasts, but when I've been reading your blogs, like the wonderfully titled Unbindable Chemi Schmidt, and I've been reading all these things, taking your perspective on cryptographic algorithms, I get the sense that you're really passionate not only to help others understand more about why these things matter, but actually have a bit of fun with the topic. Why is that kind of thing important to you?
So I think having fun with the topic is, at least for me, it's the way to learn. And I think it's true for many people that like, I usually, the way that I go about, like, especially with these PQC things, I like have to evaluate, implement a lot of algorithms. And the way I go about this is usually I start implementing it in a very high level language. And then I attempt to break it for like several months to a year or so, because I'm like, there's no way that this is secure, and like just try to break it. And after I like fail, because like obviously I won't break a scheme that like has been already tested by quite a few of my peers. That way I build like a much deeper understanding in this. And like I think playing with these things and thinking about not just the very dry properties that these schemes have, but also like a lot of my work is on sort of properties that you might think that these schemes have, but that nobody ever said that they would have, and that they may or may not actually give you. Like I did a lot of stuff on misbinding things, where like you sort of turn things around and ask like, can an adversary choose a key in a specific fashion so that they suddenly can produce some very surprising artifacts, where like you get the same shared secret under two different ciphertexts and so on. I did this very fun thing where like, we have signature schemes, and you can take like you can do what the signature scheme does and like sign a message and get authenticity. But you can also ask like, so if I have a message and a signature, do I actually know which public key signed this and stuff like that? So for me, taking this like kind of playful approach with these schemes, it helps to widen sort of the understanding of these things, and it helps to avoid somewhat common problems that you see when you look at actual cryptographic protocols. Like these misbinding properties, they don't come from anywhere either. Like these are actual vulnerabilities that are behind those things, where like by assuming that this thing has some properties that nobody ever said that it would, but that makes sense, you build this assumption into your protocol without ever having like entertained whether or not this is there. And if the scheme happens to not have this property, then you break your protocol, and you have a vulnerability there.
And when you've been bridging that world, you've transitioned from the sort of maybe drier academic side to a company who's using these in very real and practical ways. What's been maybe the biggest culture shock, the biggest difference that you've seen in the approaches there?
I think a lot of especially in industry outside of cryptography, there is a lot less of a like mathematics has this very strict mindset where you formulate your hypotheses, you conjecture statements, and then you try to prove them or disprove them. And I see, not in cryptography, but like outside of cryptography, I see a lot of sort of people making stuff up ad hoc and seeing what works. And sort of cryptography is interesting in that applied cryptography has to interact with this world where most stuff is kind of ad hoc, while at the same time also coming from this very strict mathematical realm. And also, if you do this approach to cryptography, stuff breaks very badly. And so having to navigate this sort of reality of how do I get people to actually do the things that I know that they need to do, that I think has been the most learning experience of how do I get people to do stuff, is much more part of my world than I might have thought when I was like 20 years old or so.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting when I was reading your blogs and you were talking about concepts like hashing and pre-hashing, very commonly used in cryptography and computer security. But, you were also saying, actually, in the perfect world of mathematics, these aren't things we really touch upon. These aren't concepts. So I'm guessing that's been an interesting thing to look at things and go, why are they doing these things? What's the purpose of these? And, is there a better way to do them?
Yeah, the pre-hashing one is a great example. JWT is another great example for that, where JWT is something that sort of snuck up on cryptographers, where cryptographically speaking, the cryptographers descended up from the heavens with these perfect signature schemes that allow you to sign any blob. And then people decided that wasn't good enough, and they invented JWT. And understanding why that happened, and then being in the room where it happens and making sure that you can have your JWT if you need them, but if you do it slightly differently, then it's actually secure. Those things are I think some of the more interesting parts of this role of how do you marry this sort of very strict and formal world with the kind of messy reality, and how do you get the reality to fit with that?
And in your kind of day-to-day role, aside from spending months or years just kind of looking at a thing, trying to work out all the different angles, how it could be broken, what are some of the other activities you get involved in?
Yeah, so my main role is to do reviews across the company. So maybe I should explain what ISE Crypto, my team, where it comes from and what it does. So ISE is Google's information security engineering, is our standard application security team. It started out with reviewing code across the company on security. And ISE Crypto within that team was sort of the subgroup that formed eventually of okay, sometimes people actually need cryptographic expertise and we need to review that code too. And from there, things sort of developed into this mindset shift that we have with the secure by design idea of like developers produce vulnerabilities not because they love producing vulnerabilities, but because the tooling, the like libraries and infrastructure that they work with do not allow it to be easy to do the right things. They make it hard to do the right things and like somewhat easy to do the wrong things. Like, yeah, if you want a very blunt example, you can compare C++ to Rust. Like C++, very easy to do the wrong things. And if you take a slightly different approach and like come up with something like Rust, you don't get the same memory problems because they are sort of built into the toolings. And this kind of approach we try to apply to sort of every part of what security is working on. And again, ISC Crypto within that is doing that to cryptography, where our main approach has been writing a cryptographic library called Tink that is open source and that is mostly just wrapping boring SSL, but taking the sharp edges away. And so, since you were asking what my day job looks like, it is for me these days mostly doing like sort of reviews and kind of policy setting for cryptography. And somewhat also writing cryptographic code with especially PQC algorithms, and somewhat like trying to lead the design on Tink, getting like making sure that the lessons that we learn in reviews of what people A need and B what mistakes they usually make sure that these lessons go back into the like library that is designed to avoid these kinds of problems. Yeah, that is sort of what I'm doing most of the time.
I really like the way you phrased it there, of taking the sharp edges away from these tools, like just making it safer for people to use them. Because I work for a company who does a lot of things around removing local administrator rights and stopping users being able to easily, effectively shoot themselves in the foot because they have sufficient privilege on the machine to inflict damage, to misconfigure things, to break things. And in the very same way, you've got those languages, those standards, those libraries we all rely on and import. And we've seen time and time again where they're not secure by default. They're easy to misconfigure, or there's vulnerabilities that no one's ever really, like you're saying with some of the crypto algorithms, no one's ever really looked at them this way. So no one's ever seen this particular weakness. And I thought one of the interesting, stories we were talking to you on the research call around this was when you started looking at an Amazon SDK, and you just started with, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step. Your journey into vulnerability discovery started with searching for the word crypto. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about where searching for crypto took you and what that finding was.
Yeah, that was a very funny story. Like, someone wanted to import the Amazon SDK, and it's like, I think it was like a whole giant thing. It was, I think, the S3 SDK. It might have been other SDKs in there as well. And so I had this ginormous CL review assigned to me, where like CL being change list, Google internal term for PR. This giant PR assigned to me. That like I was like, okay, I can just hit the approve button because it's Amazon, who cares? Or like, I assume that they do this correctly, but I should do it like at least a cursory glance. And I looked at so I just searched for the word crypto and like kind of like figuring out why was this even assigned to me. Like in this giant code base somewhere there's something about cryptography. So I searched for that, and I was like kind of expecting that this takes like 2 minutes. I look what they do and decide that, yeah, this is fine. And so I look at what they do and I was like, that's kind of weird. That's not how you're supposed to do that. And like I figured out after searching for crypto that like the reason that I was on this pull request in the first place was that it used MD5 for something, which if I had known that before, I would probably not even have bothered to look further, because I was like, yeah, these storage systems, they always use MD5, even though they should know better, but like, it's fine for this use case. But then I noticed that what they used MD5 for was a weird kind of bypassing the encryption of the file and sort of extracting the MD5 of the file itself as well, which if your file has too little entropy, which most files do not necessarily have that much entropy, then knowing the hash of the file is the same as knowing the file. And then I also looked further, and there was this very curious problem that is similar to the problem that JWT has, where it defined the algorithm that was used for encrypting the file with the file together. So if I had write access to the file, I could also write what algorithm it was using for encrypting the file. And so when I can do that, then I can change the algorithm. And this is again one of these things of like, nobody ever looks at it from that angle, because you're not supposed to be able to do that. There's like, basically, once I can take a ciphertext and tell the system, here, takes this ciphertext, but instead of interpreting as the ciphertext that it actually is, interpret it in this different mode, please. But use your key. Now, like, the modes have their security proofs, but the security proofs usually rely on the fact that I have specific access to specific oracles that like allow me to decrypt under this mode. If it says nothing about the fact that, well, maybe I have an access to an oracle that decrypts things under a completely different mode. And so in this case, it was like using AHGCM by default, but you could switch it to CBC. So you have this very fun vulnerability where you take the GCM ciphertext, you tell it that this is actually CBC ciphertext, and then you say, try to decrypt it, please, but don't tell me the result, just tell me whether it works or not. And then by doing that, if you set things up correctly so that like things work out for CBC mode, then you get to the point where this will either work or it will fail based on whether you guessed 16 bytes of the plain text correctly. And so with that, go from GCM where basically GCM will either work and I wouldn't learn nothing about anything at all, because like I'm not supposed to see what happens with the decryption itself. I just learn whether it works or doesn't work. Or if I change any single bit of this ciphertext, then GCM mode will fail. And so I wouldn't learn anything from that. Like I would learn whether or not I changed a bit of the ciphertext, but I knew that already. But by telling it that, oh, this is actually CBC, and I manipulate it in such a way that it fails only under specific circumstances, I now get to check my assumptions whether the plain text was a certain value or not. And with that, I can, assuming that it's not that like it has like that I can reasonably guess 16 bytes of plain text, I can now decrypt the file. This is like, it's one of these very surprising things of like, yeah, you do this thing that is kind of nobody has ever really assumed in academia that you would do it this way, but in practice it happens quite frequently. And yeah, so that was how I discovered this vulnerability, and Amazon fixed it, it was pretty neat.
I mean, you're describing it as, a fun thing, and I'm trying to keep up with all the terminology here. What was the reaction from Amazon themselves? Were they surprised that this existed and that you'd found this, or was it something where they knew that maybe there was something going on there?
So what happened on Amazon side, as far as I know, you will have to ask the Amazon people for that, for the details there. From what I've gathered is that this wasn't code that was written by their cryptography team. Kind of like, as you assume, they have a capable cryptography team that wouldn't make mistakes like this. But this was code that was written by someone, some like generic software engineer, and it gets you to this like this is kind of the types of problem that we try to prevent from happening, of like uh, um, people introducing vulnerabilities, not even realizing that they're doing something dangerous. Because, yeah, they were using cryptography. They were not even doing anything that is out of the ordinary. Like JWT has very similar problems by design. And so, like, knowing when you need to ask a cryptographer is one of the hardest parts of the whole thing, because they were not like writing cryptographic code. I'm pretty sure they didn't think that they were rolling their own cryptography, but by like because we have all these sharp edges, we get to this point where you end up writing your own cryptography even though you don't intend to. As far as I know, what Amazon did in reaction is they reorganized things so that like their cryptography team is in charge of these kinds of parts of the library. And like as far as I've heard, they've taken this very seriously, and like tried to take steps that this doesn't happen again.
So when a company's at the scale of a Google or an Amazon there, that obviously they're going to have a team of dedicated friendly cryptographers like yourself. What advice would you give to software engineers who are working in companies where they don't have dedicated cryptographers in-house? They're doing things, time and time again. I've seen developers fall down like you just mentioned, the roll your own crypto route, because they're like, well, I'll just XOR this data with this random static key and then everything's secure and encrypted. So what advice would you give to people in companies without dedicated cryptography experts?
Yeah. So in those cases, it's a bit of a sliding scale. As I mentioned, Tink is open source, so you can use that directly as like a way that like somewhat helps avoid some of the more easy to avoid mistakes. But I have to also say that Tink is not necessarily something that, if you have zero cryptography experience, it's not necessarily super easy to use either. There are some companies out there that do cryptography consulting. Khalif is one that like my ex-teammate is leading. There is Trail of Bits and NCC Group. Those are, I think, the biggest ones. And yeah, when in doubt, get your code reviewed externally, because it is very, very hard to reason through this if you do not have the background. And some things that look very benign turn out to be very broken, and some things that look very broken turn out to be completely secure. Which that's the flip side of what also happens a lot when you do these reviews. You find these very, very bad constructions that end up being secure. But yeah, like definitely get your code reviewed. You can try to build your own background in cryptography, but the faster path certainly is to just have someone review it externally.
Great. Oh, thank you for the advice. And I think an interesting thing in your area is, most of us planning near-term 1, 5, maybe 10-year roadmaps, but things in the kind of your world are often on a different timescale and sometimes timeless concepts. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you came to work on a solution in Google Duo Chat that will potentially mitigate exploitation until the year 909,000.
909,000. Oh, that story. Yes. That was a great story. So that is another thing of like accidentally designing a cryptographic protocol. The story there was that they was a chat application, and they were using Signal protocol for the base of it, which very secure, very well reviewed. And my coworker reviewed their approach there, was like, yeah, this looks very good. And then they had this problem, and the problem was that sometimes messages would fail to decrypt. And cryptography does not really give you the best advice there. in that, like, the typical cryptographer advice is if something fails to decrypt, you just walk away. You just pretend you never talked to this person at all, which is doable if that happens very rarely. But if these failure to decrypt happen with some frequency because of like the realities of computer systems getting corrupted, you can't really do that. So they needed to recover from these failed to decrypt message situations, and they sent these failed to decrypt messages. And they were like, we can't really encrypt those because we failed to decrypt, so we don't really have an encryption key. But we could at least sign them. So we signed them with, well, the only key that we have, which is the identity key in Signal. And this part they didn't talk to my coworker about. This part they just added. And so later, for like an unrelated reason, they were asking me a question about something, and I was like, we need to just make sure that we add domain separation so that we don't like use the signature out of context. And then they were like, what are you meaning using the signature out of context? Because that would be very bad if that was like something that's possible, right? And so what had happened is that they had these failed to decrypt messages, which were the ciphertext that was failing to decrypt, followed by a timestamp, which they signed and sent back as failed to decrypt message. But the other use of the identity key that they had was you sign a challenge together with a timestamp and then send that back to change your identity key. So what now you can do, since these look very similar, what I can do is I get the challenge, I send the challenge to the party that I want to exploit. They will fail to decrypt the challenge because it's meaningless. It's not a valid ciphertext. So now they need to say that they failed to decrypt this message. They add a timestamp and they sign the whole thing and send it back to me. So now I take this and say like, here, I would like a new identity key, please. So they had this problem and they were like, oh shit, we should probably fix this. This looks very bad. And then they were like, well, we kind of like have a lot of old clients out there that we would preferably not touch. Is there any way of doing that? And I was like, I'm not sure if we can do that. But there was one saving grace that they had. While they had the same format of like some ciphertext or nonce or something, followed by a timestamp, the timestamps were different. One of them was big endian and the other one was little endian. And so that still would make it vulnerable, but it would mean that you only were vulnerable once every hour. The way that like the precision timestamps that they had, it was so that like every hour there would be a time when forwards and backwards was in the same like time period. But they also didn't really need the precision of the timestamp. Like they don't really need the timestamp to be like millisecond accurate. So what they did was they fixed the least significant bytes of one timestamp to be ones. And that means that now when you revert it to from little endian to big endian, now the one gets to the very end of the timestamp, and now it's very far in the future. So this problem will not occur until like the year 99,000 something. So basically, this way you were able to rescue this protocol. The old clients completely understand everything that is happening. They just see timestamps. But like at least new clients do not have this vulnerability anymore because they will not accept a signature that has the wrong that has the wrong timestamp. Well, they will only ever produce signatures that are for so far in the future that like we have other problems.
I mean, it's a fantastic example of a very practical save there on a problem that was, again, caused by exactly the same thing you were talking about earlier, which is someone not consulting a cryptographer, someone not necessarily understanding why this could be, and not in, the way you're looking at things from all the possible angles there. So I just think it's a fantastic example of a mitigation in a very practical way that uses that kind of that knowledge you had from academia along with the very practical side of the work you're doing within Google. And hopefully, as much as people I'm sure love Google Duo Chat, I'm assuming it's still around.
I think they deprecated it. I'm not sure.
Yeah. So anyway, it would be so safe long into the future potentially because of that. So if you have an old client kicking around that's still using that, and if it's still supported, you can rest assured that that's safe there. We're starting to run down the clock here. So one of the things you've mentioned a few times is PQC, post-quantum cryptography. So maybe how would you explain post-quantum cryptography to non-cryptographers?
Yeah. That was like the first thing that I thought that you were going to when you mentioned of stuff in the far future, because it's certainly so. The problem behind quantum computing and post-quantum cryptography is we have this at the moment mostly theoretical computer design in the quantum computer that is fundamentally different in what kind of problems it can solve. And this architecture happens to be able to solve problems that our normal computers can't solve. And while they cannot solve any problem faster than a normal computer, they can solve one problem a lot faster than a normal computer. It just so happens that this problem is the one that we based all of our asymmetric cryptography on. So all signature schemes, all asymmetric encryption and so on is all based on the one problem that quantum computers are really good at solving. And that means that once this quantum computer exists, not just in theory, but in reality, and people are working fairly hard on trying to build them, not necessarily to break encryption, but also to do other things with that different architecture. Once you have this computer, it kind of breaks the internet as we know it. Like we wouldn't have secure connections anymore. We wouldn't have signatures anymore. Like the modern internet as it is based on TLS and WebPKI and so on just would cease to be secure sort of overnight as this computer is developed. And there is a solution to this, and it's not even as terrible as it sounds like at first. Like at first it sounds like, oh, these quantum computers destroy everything. But as I said, they are not better computers per se. They are different computers. And so while there are problems that they can solve very easily, like the stuff that we base modern cryptography on, there are also problems that they can't solve any faster than a normal computer can. And we can base cryptography on those. And that is sort of what NIST has been doing for the last, I think, more than 6 years, 10 years or so. No, 8 years, I think. For the last 8 years, NIST has been having this competition where they try to come up with standards that replace our current cryptography, our current asymmetric cryptography. The approach that NIST has there is this competition format where multiple teams around the world submit their proposals. They get evaluated. It's multiple rounds, lots of discussion. And in the end, which happened this August, NIST comes out with a standard. And so we have the first set of post-quantum cryptographic standards now. So the main problem is, if you have a quantum computer, we can break cryptography. That also means that some things we need to work on way before we have that quantum computer, because, if you want to keep things secret for the next 10 years or so, or whatever it takes people to build this quantum computer, you need to start with the transition now. If you have something like a hardware device that has a public key embedded in it, you need to start the transition now, because otherwise your hardware device will no longer be secure in 10 years, and maybe you want your hardware to last longer than that. And the last thing is like these new schemes, while they solve the same things, have subtly different properties. One of the biggest things is that they're much larger. We kind of got very lucky when it came to the first round of cryptography and came up with stuff that was extremely small, all things considered. Where these alternative cryptographic algorithms, they're about the same speed as what we have right now, but they produce much larger like signatures, public keys, ciphertexts. Current cryptography is somewhere between like 32 bytes to 256 bytes. PQC starts at a kilobyte, and you can easily get to like things like 8 kilobyte signatures and stuff like that. And so the last problem area that we need to work on early is cases where we have a lot of constraints on like bandwidth and things like that, or like in general ecosystems that are hard to change, that like don't necessarily tolerate these changes very well. Those also need to be worked on early so that we actually have an idea of what we do there. Like the biggest example there, I think, is WebPKI. Because we live in a world where signatures were basically free, we gotten to the point that your standard TLS handshake has like something like 7 signatures on it. And that's fine if they're 64 bytes. If the signatures is suddenly like 3.5 kilobytes, you run into some problems because now you're transmitting substantially more data for the cryptography than your actual payload. And so that is something where we will need to figure out, like, maybe we don't need all of these signatures. Maybe we can have a completely different approach to how we do WebPKI in the first place. And like, how can we sort of live in this post-quantum world where we have very different where we have algorithms with very different properties and need to sort of get things to still work well with each other. So that is sort of the main motivators to like both why we work on quantum computing and why we work now on post-quantum cryptography.
Thinking about the challenges that are out there, there's a lot of, again, there's a hype and there's vendors trying to sell everyone on what they need. What would be, say, a quick test for deciding if you actually need a quantum random number generator?
That was, I had a bit of fun with that one. That is like something that people try to sell you these quantum anything. And the idea behind that is like our current random number generators are based on thermodynamics, on thermodynamics and like thermal noise, which is plenty noisy. And like my quick test there is write down a secret number on a piece of paper, set it on fire, hand the ashes and the smoke to the people trying to sell you that device, and ask them to tell you the secret. Based on the kind of joke nature there of like theoretically just having sort of the products of the combustion would be enough to reconstruct the state before it was burned. In practice, so we all know that is not really the case. And this is kind of similar to the difference between like a thermodynamical random number generator and a quantum random number generator. If you're basing stuff on thermodynamics, in theory, if you knew the position of every air molecule in the room and you pretended that they don't have quantum effects going on as well, you could calculate of what happens on this thermodynamical random number generator. And like if you cooled things down to like a ridiculous amount to like 3 kelvins or something, you would get like very predictable results. And even if you start cooling it down to somewhat a low temperature, you start getting more predictable. And so there is some truth to the fact that like in theory it is somewhat predictable. And if you compare that to the quantum random number generator, quantum processes are kind of random by nature. Like where the thermodynamics is things like throwing a dice, where in theory, if I know everything about this dice, then I know how it will land and I can calculate how it bounces and so on. The quantum random numbers, there is no way of predicting them. Like predicting them is fundamentally impossible in nature. But in practice, yes, rolling dice is like literally the proverbial randomness generator, and we don't really have an ability to predict what a roll of dice would have as an outcome. Neither do we have the ability to predict what like our normal random number generator that we use in everyday hardware, what kind of outcome they have. So yeah, you don't really need the quantum random number generators. They don't really help you solve a problem that you actually have.
I thought it was just a lovely way of taking a very complex problem with a lot of knowledge you need to explain why, yes, theoretically it's possible, but in practice you don't need this, and you just condensed it down in that one message. I also like the idea of someone trying to sell you something and you just burning a piece of paper and handing it to them. I thought that was maybe something.
I have not tried this approach in real life.
Again, maybe theoretically it's an interesting approach, but practically it falls down as a thing to do in a business meeting. Before we run out of time here, this podcast is called Adventures of Alice and Bob, and I feel like you, more than any guest, have probably had many adventures with Alice and Bob, in the very practical sense. And I wondered if you had a favorite Alice and Bob example, or maybe there's just a common misconception about cryptography or algebra that you wanted to highlight to the audience.
Let's see, favorite Alice and Bob example. I think that there's with Alice and Bob stories, they work very well for explaining cryptographic protocols and cryptography. And it's always interesting, kind of tying back to the beginning of sort of this playful approach of trying to get Alice and Bob and the other characters in the story to do something completely different that is not what they would usually try to do. Alice trying to forge a message instead of having Mallory do that and things like that. So there's a lot of fun that you can have, and where the Alice and Bob metaphor really helps you to be well, maybe Alice doesn't want to play nice today, that is very, very helpful if you want to sort of explore the limits of a protocol more deeply. So I really do like the analogy with Alice, or I don't know, it's not really an analogy or metaphor, the instrument of Alice and Bob, and using it to its full extent, not just as convenient ways of saying A and B without repeating yourself, but actually sort of considering them as characters that maybe do things that you don't expect from them all the time.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, because one of the things in software development, we talk about user stories and acceptance criteria, but there is that thing of, taking it from the attacker's perspective of well, how do I use this system in a way it wasn't intended? And maybe we need a spin-off podcast, Adventures of Alice and Bob off-grid, misbehaving or whatever it is, because it's the thing that people quite often miss, that they'll think about how to implement a piece of software, cryptography, in the way that they expect it to be used, but there's many other ways that could be used and abused. And as you highlighted with your examples earlier, that people with good intentions will implement solutions that actually introduce vulnerabilities without realizing it, because they haven't taken it from that perspective. One of the things you said at the start was, you were interested in algebra, and then you got interested in cryptography, and you were reading books around that. If there's someone listening to the podcast who's, you're passion for this is clearly infectious. You know, you're really excited by these concepts and they're thinking, that sounds really appealing to me. How would you recommend they get started? Are there key books, resources out there, courses that you would recommend to people?
Yeah. Dan Brunet has an amazing book, which is free online, that contains pretty much anything that you need for your undergrad in cryptography, which, it's free, it's online. I think there's also a course that there is online somewhere. That is, I think, my go-to recommendation for books. He needs to add this chapter on lattice cryptography finally, but he keeps promising that he will do that. So eventually that will be there as well.
And if people are interested in finding out more about you, the work, Tink, what are the best places to track you down or find out that information?
Yeah, so I have a blog on keymaterial.net, and I'm fairly active on Mastodon these days at Sophie Schmieg at infosec.exchange.
Fantastic. We'll include links to that in the description here. I can highly recommend reading the blog because I've had a fantastic time reading that in the past week. I didn't even get the chance to start asking you about invisible salamanders. That's a whole other conversation, I feel. But
yes,
if you want to learn more about invisible salamanders and some of the challenges there, the blog mentioned, and it'll be linked in the description, is a great place to go to start to dive into the pure world of mathematics and how that meets the practical world of cryptography and computer security. So unfortunately, that's all we have time for today on Adventures of Alice and Bob. A huge thanks to our guest today, the unbreakable Sophie Schmieg, an algebraic geometer with a passion for helping us all secure ourselves in a post-quantum world, and while also teaching us a thing or two about invisible salamanders and other topics along the way. So thank you very much for all you're doing, and really looking forward to your continued efforts in this field. As always, thanks to our super producer, Jesse, and the team at BeyondTrust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maud, and this time it's really been the Adventures of Alice and Bob.